The Lighthouse, written by Finn Wilder. Chapter 1. The Offer. The lighthouse stood tall and solitary against the storm-battered coast, its unwavering beams slicing through the thick, swirling fog and the relentless darkness of night. Perched on a rugged, wind-swept cliff, it served as a beacon of hope for ships navigating the treacherous waters below, where jagged rocks waited like open jaws. This place, remote and wild, was as untamed as the ocean itself, harsh, yet offering a strange comfort in its isolation. For Aki, the lighthouse had become more than just a place of work. It was his refuge, a sanctuary where he could finally breathe in peace, far removed from the noise, chaos and cruelty of the world he had left behind. Life here had a quiet rhythm, and the isolation suited him. The solitude had become like an old friend, a trusted companion he felt completely at ease with. At first glance, it was clear that Aki was no ordinary young man. His slight, almost fragile frame and graceful movements were far more delicate than those of a typical human male in their late teens. But what truly set him apart were the distinctive large, furry cat ears perched atop his head, and his long, slender fur tail that swayed behind him. Everything about him, his light step, his quiet alertness, hinted at an otherworldly agility and grace, a reminder that Aki, though he appeared fully human save for his cat ears and tail, was something different. For Aki was a Neko, a rare hybrid of human and feline. In the bustling city where he had once lived, these traits had marked him, and those like him, as different. Neko were a unique and often misunderstood race, sometimes referred to as demi-human, living among humans, yet always a step outside their world. They were mostly found working in large towns and cities, filling roles as servers, waiters, busboys, cleaners, or other more menial jobs. Despite being of average intelligence, although slightly lower than that of humans, Neko were often dismissed as lesser beings, considered by many as second-class citizens. This perception, fueled by the fact Neko were not particularly tall, strong, or assertive, made them easy targets for mistreatment and even easier to pass over for promotions. Their petite stature, gentle nature, quiet demeanour, and lack of confidence, along with their ability to endure without complaint, only reinforced the cruel stereotypes, leaving them vulnerable to bullying, exploitation, and abuse. There were no Neko large business owners, no Neko in positions of power, politics, or influence. Most relied on employment for their survival, and the jobs available to them were almost always in the service sector, usually at the lower end of the pay and conditions spectrum. Neko communities were usually tucked away in forgotten districts of the city, places where humans rarely ventured unless they sought something illicit or seedy. These areas were often home to clandestine establishments catering to human clientele, where Neko workers were frequently exploited. It was also where the more unsavoury and cowardly elements of human society, usually emboldened by alcohol and the safety of numbers, would descend on drunken rampages, harassing the Neko residents, vandalising their property, and inflicting their twisted cruelty, secure in the knowledge that the Neko would offer little to no resistance. For some it seemed to satisfy a darker need to assert dominance over a race they viewed as inferior, feeding their egos and reinforcing the cruel hierarchies that permeated the city. However, it was not all bad. There were also those humans who found the Neko endearing, charmed by their adorable feline features and gentle and sweet-loving nature. Many enjoyed visiting the restaurants and cafes where Neko worked, just to be near them. Patrons often loved to pet their ears and tails, and while most Neko appreciated and enjoyed this positive attention, some were a little less keen and merely smiled, tolerating it, just grateful it wasn't aggressive. But even these moments of apparent kindness were always overshadowed by the general ongoing harsher realities of daily life, leaving most Neko generally wary of humans. The mixed treatment they received, sometimes kind but more often dismissive, abrasive, or outright abusive, left many Neko perpetually anxious, weary, and withdrawn. Depression ran deep within their communities, a silent epidemic born of neglect and mistreatment. Many longed to escape from a world that seemed to view them with disdain, yet the paths available to them were always so painfully limited. For Aki, the city was a world of contrasts. On one side were the humans he liked, those who treated him with genuine fondness and kindness, often charmed by his gentle, caring demeanour and those big, soft, adorable cat ears. Many were regulars at the cafe where he worked as a server. He enjoyed being around them and waiting on them, and they always seemed pleased to be served by him. Aki was always very happy to let them pet his furry ears and tail whenever they asked, and their affections combined with his sweet nature often led to generous tips. But these enjoyable moments were mostly fleeting, always overshadowed by the ongoing stress and harsh treatment from those wielding power over him, including his employers, who routinely took most of his tips for themselves. This unfair practice left Aki with little to show for the extra kindness he received, only amplifying the sting of an already difficult job. Aki had worked as a waiter or server for over a decade, ever since he was old enough to carry a drinks tray without spilling it. It was the only real skill and experience he had. But throughout his entire career, his human employers had exploited his quiet and benevolent nature, treating him as if he were little more than a tool. They routinely belittled him, often in front of customers, dismissed his concerns, stole his tips, and almost always seemed to take twisted pleasure in making his life as difficult or stressful as possible. The unrelenting pressure to meet his employer's demands, combined with the constant mistreatment, had taken a heavy toll on Aki. He hadn't even reached his 20s yet, but was already emotionally and physically worn down by life. Often he found himself questioning the point of it all. Is this all there is? He would ask himself, feeling like his entire existence was just a constant cycle of endless exploitation and struggle. Despondent and weary, Akai gradually started to retreat inward, longing for an escape from the suffocating weight of the city and its relentless demands. His small apartment, a cramped space in a dilapidated building on the edge of a neglected district, was a constant reminder of his struggle. The peeling wallpaper and thin walls offered little protection from the noise outside. Most of his wages went toward the exorbitant rent and bills, leaving him with little money and just a few cherished possessions, mementos of his late parents, a worn photograph of them holding him as an infant, smiling together, a small, faded blanket his mother had knitted for him, and his well-loved stuffed toy from his childhood, called Momo, that he still often cuddled at night. Amid the drab surroundings, these few items were his only solace, fueling his dreams of a life far away from the oppressive city, a place he could escape the world's expectations and simply be. So when an extraordinary and unexpected opportunity appeared one day, Aki felt a rare sense of hope that something transformative might just be within reach. It had been a particularly busy and exhausting day at the cafe, with patrons coming and going in a steady stream. Now, as closing time approached, the atmosphere had transformed into a rare quietude. The clatter of dishes and buzz of conversation had faded, leaving Aki to clear the last few tables at his own pace, without that stressful sense of urgency. The cafe was almost serene, with only a couple of regular patrons lingering, enjoying the serenity of a final beverage or snack before their commute home. Among them was a middle-aged man with a kind, laid-back demeanour. He caught Aki's eye. The man had always been decent, never treating Aki like an oddity or making unreasonable demands. Today, though, his gaze seemed more intent, as if he'd noticed something different. "You look like someone with the weight of the world on your shoulders," the man said quietly, his voice expressing concern. "Everything all right, lad?" Aki paused, gripping the tray tighter. No one ever really asked how he was doing, and he wasn't used to anyone caring. But there was something about this man's tone, a warmth that made Aki feel like, for once, it might be okay to open up. "I'm just tired, sir," Aki admitted softly, keeping his gaze down. "Tired of the noise, the city, this place. I need to get away, but I don't know how." He shifted uncomfortably, aware that he was probably saying too much, but unable to stop. The man listened, nodding empathetically. He took a slow sip of his coffee and leaned back, regarding Aki with his kind eyes for a moment. "Have you ever thought about leaving the city for good?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Finding somewhere quieter?" Aki blinked, slightly taken aback by the question. He had thought about it, many times, but it had always felt like an impossible dream, something he simply wasn't allowed to want. "I think about it, often," he admitted, shrugging slightly. "But it just doesn't seem possible. Where would I go? I don't exactly have options lined up and—" He hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if not wanting to be overheard. "I don't think people like me are in much demand outside the city," he whispered. The man nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Setting his cup down, he leaned in a little, lowering his voice. "Well, it's funny you should say that. I actually work for an employment agency, and we've had a particular job sitting vacant for quite a while. It's not in the city, though. It's on a small island way out west, far from civilization. The island is almost completely cut off. No neighbours, no visitors, just the sea and the land. Supplies are brought in once a month and you'd be on your own most of the time. The extreme isolation has made it hard to fill the position. No one's been interested. But if you're really looking to get away from it all, this could be perfect for you. The job, you see, is running a lighthouse." Aki's mind went blank for a moment as the unexpected offer sank in. A lighthouse on a remote island. The notion seemed almost surreal, like something from a distant dream. He stared at the man, his daily grind and the oppressive city life flashing through his mind. The idea of escaping to such an isolated, peaceful-sounding place felt like a fantasy he had never dared to imagine. It sounded beyond perfect. As the thought of possibility quickly settled in, a sudden surge of wonder and hope spontaneously began to blossom within him. Could this be his chance? The chance he had dreamt of all his life, to step away from the constant pressure and find the solitude he'd only ever dreamed about? Seeing Aki's stunned expression, the man smiled kindly. "I've been coming to this cafe for a while now, and I've seen you often enough to believe you might be just the right person for the job. You're intelligent, loyal, dependable, and you clearly care. The job itself is simple. You just need to keep the lighthouse running. We would arrange for all the training you need, so there's no reason to worry about that. But what it really requires is someone who's comfortable with the isolation, someone who wants it. And I have a feeling that someone might be you. If you're interested, I'd be more than happy to put in a word for you." Aki's eyes widened, the weight of the offer hitting him like a tidal wave. A way out, a real escape. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. His chest tightened with emotion as he struggled to speak, his voice trembling. Do you really think I could do it, sir?" The man's expression softened, and he nodded keenly. "The job itself is a breeze, pays quite well too, and from what I've seen you're clearly more than capable. But this isn't a job for just anyone. The isolated and remote location demands a special kind of person, someone who needs peace as much as the lighthouse needs a caretaker. It didn't occur to me until just now, but it feels as if this lighthouse job has been waiting for someone like you to come along." The man smiled. "It seems like you're searching for peace and solitude, and that's exactly what the lighthouse offers. I think there's an opportunity here if it's something you'd like to consider. Aki was so overwhelmed by this profound, life-changing idea that his eyes suddenly welled up, a tear slipping down his cheek before he could stop it. Quickly he wiped it away, trying to maintain his composure. "Thank you, sir. I think I'd like that. Very much." The man smiled, giving a reassuring nod. He noticed the sudden spark of hope in Aki's eyes, a stark contrast to the downcast look he'd seen moments before. Over the months, as Aki had quietly served him coffee, the man had come to admire the Catboy's determination and gentle spirit. Now, fully realizing the weight of his proposal and the potential impact it could have on Aki's young life, he felt a deep sense of responsibility to ensure this opportunity didn't slip away. "I'll make some calls," the man assured him, "and either way, you'll hear from me very soon. You have my promise." Aki stood there for a moment, stunned and overwhelmed. It felt as if the door to a different life may have just opened in front of him, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he could finally walk through it. The Lighthouse. Chapter 2. The Training. With the paperwork complete and contracts in place, Aki moved to the island just a few weeks after the initial proposal. He reminisced on that day in the cafe when the kind man had offered him a way out of the city. At the time, the idea had seemed almost surreal, like a dream too distant to grasp. Yet here he was now, standing on the threshold of a new life, the city and its oppressive weight already starting to feel like a distant memory. The island, with its promise of peace and solitude, felt like something out of a storybook, and a chance for freedom he had scarcely dared to imagine. For the first week, Aki wasn't alone in the lighthouse. An older man had been sent to train him, gruff but kind, with a white beard, white hair, and a rugged appearance that made him look every bit the part of an old sea captain. The man hadn't been told he'd be training a Neko, and was visibly surprised at first. Though he had never met one, he'd heard the usual rumours, that Neko were unintelligent, unclean and unreliable. Still, he remained polite and impartial, choosing to treat Aki as he would any other trainee. But it didn't take long for the old man to warm to Aki. There was something about this cat-eared boy's politeness, his gentle nature, and his eagerness to learn that quickly charmed him. By the second day, the man had fully shed any misconceptions he'd previously had, openly praising Aki for his attentiveness and dedication. He was impressed not only by Aki's eagerness to learn, but also by how quickly he'd grasped each task. "You've got a knack for this, lad," he'd say, watching as Aki meticulously followed instructions. "Most take weeks to get the hang of it, but you pick it up like it's second nature." It wasn't just Aki's learning skills that impressed him, though. The man admired Aki's quiet determination, his respectfulness, and the gentle, humble way he handled even the most mundane of tasks. It was clear to him that Aki took care and pride in everything he did, something the old man rarely saw in people anymore. In the evenings, with the lighthouse fully up and running, the two would sit together in the tiny lounge area next to the kitchen on the first floor, enjoying mugs of tea and sharing quiet conversation. For Aki, it was a new and comforting experience, spending time with a human who, instead of showing superiority or impatience, treated him as an equal, with genuine kindness and respect. The old man would happily regale Aki with stories of his days at sea and his years spent tending lighthouses along the coast. Some tales were light-hearted, full of funny mishaps and quirks of life as a sea captain, while others were laced with practical wisdom, especially when it came to surviving the worst storms. He shared life-saving advice with Aki, from the critical importance of staying inside the lighthouse at all times during the worst of storms, to recognizing the subtle signs of bad weather brewing on the horizon. "When the sea turns dark and the wind shifts suddenly, that's when you know it's time to hunker down," the man would say. his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. He also laid out the #1 golden rule: never go on or even near the rocks. The rocks may look tempting, especially on a sunny day, but they're deadly. A death trap, especially when wet. One slip and it's all over. There's no one here to save you. They might not find your body for months, if they ever do. The gravity of the man's words weighed heavily on Aki. He had never been warned so bluntly before, and the thought of being lost to the sea or the rocks left him feeling both unnerved and deeply grateful for the old man's life-saving and absolutely crucial advice. The man paused, his eyes softening. "I wouldn't want that for you, lad. You've got your whole life ahead of you. It would break my heart to hear something like that had happened." His tone, though stern, carried warmth and genuine care that felt almost fatherly to Aki. Aki nodded, feeling the weight of the man's care settle in his chest. Every piece of advice, every word, now felt like more than just instructions. They were gifts, shared with a quiet wisdom that Aki knew could mean the difference between safety and disaster. One night, as they sat together in the soft glow of lantern light, the wind howled outside, rattling the thick windows of the lighthouse. Inside it was warm and snug. They were once again seated in the little lounge area next to the kitchen, tucked away on the first floor. Every few seconds, a soft beam of light from the lighthouse swept past the small window, casting brief flashes of illumination across the room. The ocean beyond was lost in the darkness, but its presence was felt in the quiet, distant sound of waves gently crashing against the rocks below. Aki sat, curled up in his chair, cradling a warm mug of tea. The old man leaned back across from him, his weathered face softened by the low light. For a while they enjoyed the quiet, simply existing in the peaceful moment, before the old man broke the silence. "So, tell me, lad, what was life like in the city?" Hesitant at first, Aki slowly began to open up, speaking of the few good moments, but then also slowly revealing the harsh reality of his life in the city. He spoke of how Nekos were treated with disdain, the way people unfairly looked down on them, and the relentless daily struggle just to survive. The old man listened quietly, his weathered face softening as Aki's story unfolded. With each word, the weight of what Aki had endured settled in his chest, leaving him moved. By the time Aki finished, the old man's throat felt tight, and his eyes, usually so clear and steady, glistened with the threat of tears. "I never knew," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never knew it was that bad. It shouldn't be that way." His voice carried an edge of frustration, mingled with the deep sadness of realizing just how harsh Aki's reality had been. The room fell into a heavy silence, only the faint sound of the waves outside filling the space. The old man swallowed hard, fighting to steady his voice. After a long pause, he added softly, "No one deserves that, lad. Least of all you." Aki blinked, his throat tightening as the old man's words sank in. He hadn't expected such care, such genuine emotion from someone he'd only known a short time. The fact that this gruff old man, who had seen so much and lived such a hardened life, was moved by his story, made Aki feel an unfamiliar warmth. It was as if, for the first time, someone truly understood what he had been through. Feeling encouraged, the weight of his memories from the city began to lift, and he turned the conversation to his new life with a lighter heart. He spoke with growing enthusiasm about the kind man in the cafe who had told him about the Lighthouse job, a position Aki had never dreamed would be possible for someone like him. Yet here he was, now on the cusp of starting a new life, far from all the hurt and pain, a life he had only ever dreamed of. He talked about how lucky he felt, how the quiet solitude of the island felt so liberating compared to the constant noise and oppression of the city. His eyes lit up as he told the old man he had never been happier or more hopeful for his future. As Aki spoke, the old man felt an unexpected tug inside. He barely knew this kid, yet he found himself feeling responsible for him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Aki's excitement was contagious, but the old man knew the reality. He'd seen what months of isolation and bitter weather could do to a person. It's all a dream to him now, the old man thought. But he hasn't seen the worst of it yet. The loneliness, the biting cold, how it can wear you down. Aki was still riding the high of his escape from the city, but the old man knew that enthusiasm wouldn't last forever. I can't let him fail just because he doesn't know what's ahead, the man thought quietly. This isn't just about the job anymore. It's his sanity at stake. The idea of him going back to the city, it'd clearly break him. I can't let that happen. The thought lingered, heavy in his chest. He's found his way out, and I can't let him fall back into that living hell. The man didn't fully understand why he felt so compelled to help this gentle-souled young man. Maybe it was the rawness of Aki's story, the way the lad's quiet resilience reminded him of something long forgotten. But whatever it was, the desire to support and protect him was strong, and the old man knew he needed to do everything he could to help Aki thrive in this harsh, isolated lifestyle. If he's going to make this work for the long haul, he'll need more than enthusiasm, the man thought. I'll teach him everything, the tricks, the hard lessons no one else will tell him. I'll make damn sure he knows how to handle this place before it gets a chance to break him. His mind sifted through the countless bits of wisdom he'd taken for granted over the decades, the things that had kept him alive and sane. He's not going back to that damn city, the man vowed silently, his jaw tightening. Not after everything he's been through. Not because this place got the better of him. Not on my watch. Outwardly, the man gave Aki a small nod. You'll do all right here, lad. Just take it one day at a time. The sleeping quarters on the second floor consisted of 2 small metal-framed beds positioned on opposite sides of the open circular room. A single small window allowed a sliver of light to filter into the cheerfully decorated room, giving the space a clean and cosy feel. A few simple pieces of furniture, a wardrobe, a small table, and a chair at the foot of each bed added to the room's practicality. Thick, warm blankets draped over the beds, and a woven rug on the floor brought additional warmth to the space. A couple of oil lamps, casting a soft, flickering glow, enhanced the room's homely atmosphere. Nautical-themed wall hangings completed the look, making the room feel both welcoming and suited to its lighthouse setting. The old man had been surprised again. Everything he'd heard about Nekos painted them as careless or dirty, but Aki defied all those perceived stereotypes, causing the old man to, once again, question everything he'd previously heard about Nekos. He kept the living quarters spotless, paying meticulous attention to everything from the polished surfaces to the neatly arranged knickknacks and belongings. His commitment to cleanliness wasn't just limited to his surroundings either. Aki himself was always clean and immaculately groomed, a level of diligence the old man hadn't expected from his trainee. You're tidier than I ever was, the man chuckled, genuine admiration in his voice. Aki smiled softly, feeling a quiet warmth from the unexpected praise. It was during one of the first nights of his stay that the old man noticed Momo, Aki's cherished stuffed toy. As Aki settled into bed, tucking himself under the blankets, the old man happened to glance over and see the small, worn toy nestled in Aki's arms. With a soft chuckle and a twinkle in his eye, he remarked, "A little company, huh? Don't worry, lad. I've seen my fair share of stuffed toys in lighthouses. It's a common comfort, and a bit of a tradition for those who work alone." Aki was surprised, but in a good way. The warmth in the old man's tone was reassuring, far from the teasing words he'd anticipated. He smiled shyly, hugging Momo a little tighter but said nothing. The old man turned his gaze back to the book he was reading, an old thought stirring in his mind. He had seen other lighthouse keepers find their own ways to cope with the isolation, talking to objects, even giving them names. It wasn't uncommon, though people rarely talked about it openly. Seeing Momo, he realized that the little stuffed toy might play a bigger role in Aki's life than the Catboy even realized. Maybe, just maybe, Momo would be one of the things that kept him sane out here. Later, as the man drifted off to sleep, his loud rumbling snores soon filled the space. To Aki, the snoring was almost comical, like a small localized thunderstorm. But rather than being annoyed, he found it oddly endearing. Even the man who had lived such a fascinating life full of stories and adventures had his flaws, and the snoring just made him feel all the more real and down to earth. As the week of intense training drew to a close, Aki had absorbed every bit of wisdom the old man had shared. The man's dedication to Aki's success was evident in every lesson, every word of wisdom and encouragement, and every note he'd had Aki write down in his logbook. He had silently vowed to do everything in his power to help Aki succeed at the job, and thus help him avoid returning to the harsh city, and his commitment shone through in his thorough and patient guidance. Aki, he was confident, was now ready and well prepared to embrace his new role. When the time came for the old man to leave, a rugged trawler arrived to pick him up, the same boat that would return once a month to replenish the remote lighthouse's supplies. As the boat approached the island, it navigated toward the small yet sturdy jetty that jutted out from the sandy beach like a lifeline to the outside world. Made of solid stone and reinforced concrete, the jetty had clearly been built to withstand years of punishment from the rough, unforgiving seas. The trawler, about 45 feet in length, was built just as sturdily, designed to handle the harsh conditions of the open waters surrounding the island. The skipper, an adventurous and rugged woman, with a weathered but kind face, looked every bit the seasoned sailor. She was full of stories and experience, much like the old man, though not as old. As she introduced herself with a wide grin, her eyes immediately caught on Aki's ears and tail. She stopped mid-motion, her eyes widening with surprise and delight. "Well, I'll be," she exclaimed, her voice a mix of curiosity and excitement. "Never thought I'd meet a Neko in all my travels." Her gaze lingered on Aki's big furry cat ears, a delighted smile spreading across her face. "Gotta say, those ears suit you just fine. Never seen anything like it." Aki smiled shyly at the compliment, already sensing what was coming next. The woman's eyes kept darting back to his ears, a familiar look crossing her face, the same one he'd seen countless times on the faces of patrons back at the cafe. After a brief, silent pause, Aki's smile widened, and he spoke playfully. "You want to pet them, don't you?" The woman's eyes lit up with guilty amusement, and she nodded, a little sheepishly. "My goodness, they're so adorable. Would it be okay? Do you mind?" Aki laughed softly. "Not at all. Go ahead." He tilted his head slightly, and the woman reached out and gently began petting his ears. Her face lit up with childlike wonder as she ran her fingers through the warm, velvety soft fur. "Oh, they're so warm and soft, just about the softest thing I've ever felt," she said, grinning from ear to ear. Aki chuckled, enjoying the moment, pleased to bring someone else such a simple joy. Letting people pet his ears, especially those encountering a Neko for the first time, had always been one of the few things Aki had enjoyed about working in the cafe. Her reaction was familiar. He'd seen that same expression countless times, but it also reminded him how much he missed the simple pleasure of having his ears petted. "You must have an interesting time buying hats," she joked, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Aki laughed, shaking his head slightly. "You have no idea." Archie joined the old man and the skipper as they all went about unloading this month's supplies. The skipper had unpacked from the trawler a small flatbed pull-along cart with 4 wheels and raised sides, sturdy and practical for ferrying the supplies with ease. They made their way back and forth along the smooth stone path from the jetty up to the lighthouse perched on a gentle rise a few hundred yards away. The smooth, well-built path made the multiple trips manageable, though the gentle incline up to the lighthouse meant pulling the heavily loaded cart required some effort. Archie and the old man both pulled on the handle, while the skipper pushed from behind. Their unhurried teamwork and camaraderie, filled with light-hearted banter and easy conversation, made the task feel enjoyable, more like a social outing and less like a chore. After they finished unloading the supplies, the skipper turned to Archie. "I'll see you next month on the 1st. Apart from the standard supplies, if there's anything else you'd like me to bring, just get a message to me on the radio, okay?" she said with a playful wink. Archie nodded appreciatively. "Thanks," noticing that familiar glint growing in her eyes again. After a pause, he regarded her with a knowing grin. "You want to pet my ears again, don't you?" She laughed, a little sheepish, nodding. "You sure you don't mind?" Aki's grin widened. "I don't mind at all. I rather like it. It feels very soothing." He tilted his head slightly, and she reached up and gently indulged in stroking his ears one last time. "They're just so soft and fluffy," she beamed with a warm smile, her fingers lingering for a while on seeing how much Archie was enjoying the moment. Eventually, she reluctantly stopped. "Thanks for letting me indulge. You're such a sweetheart. Now you make sure you stay safe and warm, and I'll see you on the 1st. With one last smile, she gave a quick playful salute and turned to head back to the trawler. As the skipper made her way back onto the boat, the old man and Archie stood together for a moment on the jetty, both quiet, as if sensing the weight of the moment. They exchanged a glance, Aki's eyes reflecting a mix of immense gratitude and sadness, while the old man's usually stern expression had softened. Neither of them needed to say much. The quiet bond they had formed in their short time together said enough. The old man shifted on his feet, searching for the right words. "Well, you know how everything works now. You've got a good head on your shoulders and you've learned fast. If you forget anything, it's all written down in your logbook. And if you ever run into problems or have worries, remember someone will always be on the other side of the radio. Don't hesitate to ask for help if you need it. You've got what it takes, lad. I have no doubt you'll do just fine out here. Keep your chin up and stay strong. And remember, you're never truly alone here. We lighthouse folk all look after each other." Aki nodded, feeling a renewed sense of reassurance. "I'll check in on you from time to time," the man said gruffly, yet with a warm undertone. "Whether by radio or when I can in person." Aki managed a small smile. "I'd like that." The old man extended his hand to say goodbye, but just as Aki reached out to shake it, the man hesitated. With a brief grunt, he pulled Aki into a firm, gruff hug, a rare display of emotion from someone so used to keeping his feelings buried beneath a hardened exterior. Aki blinked in surprise, momentarily caught off guard by the gesture, but keenly returned the hug, feeling a sudden depth of comfort and warmth in the old man's brief embrace. "Take care of yourself, lad," the old man muttered, his voice rougher than usual, before stepping back. With that, he gave a nod, picked up his bag, and turned toward the boat. As it pulled away from the dock, Aki stood watching, feeling a tangle of emotions, sadness, a newfound confidence, but also a strange sense of isolation, fully aware that he was now truly on his own on this rugged island, for the very first time. The reality of it hit him harder than he'd expected, even though this was exactly what he had signed up for, to escape the chaos and oppression of the city. Yet the warmth of the old man and the skipper lingered in his mind. For the first time in a long while, he had encountered humans who showed him genuine kindness in such an uncomplicated way. A small part of him wished he could stay in their company if only for a while longer. But life, especially for someone like him, didn't offer such simple choices. As a Neko, Aki knew well that you couldn't always choose the people you wanted to be around. That kind of freedom was a luxury he could never fully afford. The Lighthouse. Chapter 3. The Island. After completing his training, Aki had finally begun to settle into the new rhythm of life and his responsibilities. The towering lighthouse, once so imposing and daunting, now felt more familiar as the routines became second nature. The tasks themselves were fairly straightforward: tending to the light, checking the generators, maintaining the equipment, but the peace that surrounded him was unlike anything he had known. With each passing day, the island felt less like a place of work and more like the sanctuary he had longed for. The frantic pace of the city faded with each breath of fresh sea air, replaced by the steady rhythm of the waves and the soft rustling of the wind through the wild grasses and cliffs. After a couple of weeks, Aki had fully grown accustomed to the ebb and flow of his new routine. Each day began before dawn, with soft light creeping over the horizon, spilling through the small window of the lighthouse keeper's quarters. He would wake with the familiar weight of Momo, his beloved stuffed toy, still cradled in his arms. Giving it a gentle squeeze, he'd murmur, "Good morning, Momo. Another day in our little world. I still can't believe they're actually paying me to be here." The tasks awaiting him each morning were easy enough, though some took longer than others. Still, Aki embraced them all, content in the knowledge that each task had purpose. He found peace in the simple routine and was happy to do what was required. The living quarters were nestled within the sturdy walls of the lighthouse tower, spanning 3 floors, and it was here, surrounded by the tower's reassuring stone embrace, that Aki felt truly at peace. The lighthouse was not just his job. It had become his refuge, offering him sanctuary and comfort, both physically and emotionally. Most importantly, it felt safe. The thick walls were built to endure the worst of nature's fury, providing constant reassurance that no matter how wild the storm outside, he was protected. During his training, the old man had told him more than once, "This place will keep you safe no matter what." And now, standing completely alone within its walls, Aki believed it. He could feel the brute strength of the structure, its unwavering presence a source of comfort. In the quiet moments between tasks, Aki found himself silently grateful for this comforting place he now called home. In a way, the lighthouse felt almost alive to him. He imagined its solid round walls wrapping protectively around him like a pair of arms, strong and reassuring, always there, ready to hold him steady through every storm. Aki particularly enjoyed the daily cleaning of the lighthouse's massive glass lens. The sun would climb higher, casting bright, shimmering rays through the delicate glass as he wiped. The lens had to be spotless to ensure the light shone brightly through the dark, guiding ships away from danger. As he polished the glass, he often found himself gazing out at the vast expanse of the ocean, its endless waves crashing against the rocky shore. In these moments, Aki couldn't help but reflect on the life he had left behind. The noise, the crowded streets, the endless barrage of demands. It all seemed like a distant nightmare now. He remembered the harsh voices of his former employers, the way they belittled him, stole his tips, made him feel small. Here, on this island, no one could make him feel small. The only sounds were the wind, the sea, the distant calls of seabirds, and sometimes the soft barks of seals along the shore. On calmer days, he'd even catch glimpses of whales far in the distance, their dark shapes cutting through the waves. It felt as though the island had embraced him, free from judgment, welcoming him into a place where he truly belonged. When the day's tasks were done, Aki often wandered the island, exploring its windswept terrain, woodland areas, pristine white sandy beaches with their dunes, open meadows, and small rugged hills. He had also quickly developed an unusual but quite compelling habit of walking barefoot. It hadn't started right away, but one warm, sunny afternoon, after a long morning of work, the soft grass and warm earth seemed to call to him. On a whim, he slipped off his shoes and let his bare feet press into the soil. As they touched the ground, he noticed a quiet joy radiate through him, a deep sense of connection, as if the land itself was reaching up to meet and connect with him. It felt grounding and freeing all at once, almost as though he was linked directly to the island's heartbeat. In the city, such a thing had been unimaginable. Just one more simple pleasure stripped away by the grime and cruelty of urban life. But here, it was a luxury he hadn't realized he'd been missing. It caused him to feel an undeniable bond to the land beneath him, a bond that soothed him in ways he hadn't expected. From that day on, it became a quiet ritual Aki looked forward to. On his walks, Aki began to notice the small details that made the island feel alive. Tiny crabs scuttled across the beaches, birds swooped low over the churning waves, and occasionally he'd spot seals basking on distant sandbanks or rocks. The island's solitude didn't feel lonely. It felt like a sanctuary, welcoming him as much as he welcomed it. At night, after tending to the light and ensuring its beam shone brightly across the dark waters, Aki would settle into his small bed, Momo, his beloved, worn stuffed toy, tucked securely under his arm. Though Momo was faded from years of being held, to Aki, it was a treasure, carrying memories of his parents, and a time when life had felt safe and simple. Cradling Momo close, Aki would whisper softly to it, his voice barely a murmur, as if speaking any louder might break the delicate stillness of the night. "It's so peaceful here, Momo," he'd say, the words warm and familiar. "Not like the city. I think this is where we're meant to be." As the days stretched on, Aki's bond with the island deepened. He fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as the tides. Each morning, after tending the lighthouse, he would sit on a high grassy hill overlooking the ocean, feeling the cool, soft earth beneath him. The wind would whip through his hair and tug at his clothes, but he relished it. There was something liberating, satisfyingly natural about being exposed to the elements and so deeply connected to the world around him. Sometimes, as the wind howled around the lighthouse, Aki would close his eyes and listen. It reminded him of the city in a strange way, how the wind carried a distant, muffled roar, almost like the hum of the streets and the voices of strangers passing by. But here, there was no crowd, no clamour for his attention. Just him and the wild expanse of the island. Yet in those moments, he felt so much more alive than he ever had in the city. His quiet conversations with Momo, his stuffed toy, became part of his daily routine. At night, when the stars blanketed the sky and the lighthouse beam swept across the sea, he would sit on the edge of his bed, cradling the small faded toy in his lap. "You know," he'd whisper, "I never thought I'd find a place like this." There was a softness in his voice that only the stuffed toy would ever hear. "It's lonely, sure, but it's the kind of lonely I think I needed." The island had become more than just a refuge. It was a space where Aki could breathe, where his thoughts could wander without fear. He found himself thinking back to the city less and less, though the memories still lingered at the edges of his mind. On some days, they would resurface without warning. A careless word from an employer, an obnoxious child's hand yanking on his tail, a voice mocking his big cat ears, small moments that had once seemed trivial, but now felt sharp and jagged in the stillness of the island. One afternoon, as Aki was cleaning the big glass lighthouse's lens, he caught his reflection in the curved surface. For a moment he stared at his own face, his soft ears twitching slightly in the breeze, his wide eyes reflecting the endless ocean beyond. He looked different now. Maybe it was the sunlight, or maybe it was the calmness he was beginning to feel inside. But something had changed. The lines of stress that had once creased his brow were softer. His shoulders, once hunched in defense, now carried the weight of his world with more ease. A soft smile tugged at his lips. He wasn't just keeping the lighthouse running. He was starting to feel like he was keeping himself running too. This place, with its endless sea and sky, was slowly mending the cracks in him that the city had left behind. But even the island's peace couldn't fully erase the sense of isolation. On stormy nights, as the wind howled and the sea crashed violently against the rocks, Aki would lie awake, clutching Momo. In those moments, he wondered if anyone out there even remembered he existed. It was a fleeting thought, easily dismissed in the morning light, but it lingered, like a shadow in the back of his mind, a thought that he was still, ultimately, alone. Still, those moments passed quickly, and Aki would wake each day with a renewed sense of purpose. The lighthouse was his responsibility, and the island had become his sanctuary. As long as the light continued to shine through the darkest nights, Aki knew he had found something worth holding on to, and for now, that was enough. The Lighthouse, Chapter 4, The First Signs. The days had begun to blur into a peaceful rhythm, with each morning starting before dawn, and each evening ending with the steady beam of the lighthouse cutting through the dark sky. Aki felt more connected to the island than ever. The tasks became second nature, and with every passing day his sense of contentment deepened. But despite the peace, something had begun to gnaw at the edges of his awareness, something he couldn't quite explain. It started as a vague feeling, a shift in the air when he was alone, like someone was there with him. Sometimes when he was out walking along the shore or tending to the lighthouse, he would feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, as though he was being watched. At first, he dismissed it. He had spent so much of his life in the city, surrounded by people, that perhaps the solitude of the island was playing tricks on him. But the feeling lingered, creeping into his thoughts more and more. One night, a heavy storm rolled in, fierce and relentless. The wind howled through the window recesses, creating an eerie, ghostly sound as the rain lashed against the walls like icy fingers tapping to get in. Aki was used to storms by now, but this one felt different, stronger, darker, more dangerous, as though the island itself was bracing for something more than just weather. As the storm approached, Aki worked diligently to carry out additional checks to ensure everything was ready. He double-checked the light, the mechanical systems, the fuel levels, the emergency systems, and was confident everything was in working order. Then he stepped outside, checking the last of the lighthouse's exterior systems. The wind had picked up, pulling at his hair and tugging at the edges of his coat. The air was thick with tension, and every gust seemed to scream urgency. He tightened the straps on a small storage box near the base of the lighthouse, ensuring it was secure before stepping back to look toward the cliffs. The waves below were already swelling in anticipation of the coming storm, crashing angrily against the rocks. His ears twitched at the sharp whistle of the wind, and he absent-mindedly wiped his brow with the back of his hand. That's when he felt it. The unmistakable slip of something leaving his wrist. His heart skipped. He looked down just in time to see the bracelet, The small woven leather band slipped from his wrist, caught in a sudden gust. "No!" Aki reached out instinctively, but it was too late. The bracelet soared upward, spinning helplessly in a gust of wind before drifting toward the edge of the cliffs. He watched in horror as it tumbled over the rocks, disappearing into the dangerous, jagged expanse below, exactly where he had been warned never to go. He stood frozen for a moment, watching the spot where it had vanished. That bracelet meant so much to him. It was a gift from one of the few kind souls he had met in the city. An older lady, a regular patron to the cafe with whom he had struck up a quiet friendship. On learning of his change of career, she gave him the bracelet as a small token of warmth in a world that had often been so cold. Now it was gone, lost to the rocks and waves below. Aki's chest tightened with devastation, but he couldn't linger on it. The storm was coming, and there were still preparations to make. With a heavy sigh, he tore his gaze from the cliffs and hurried back toward the lighthouse, his heart heavy as the wind whipped around him. Confident everything was ready, Aki began preparing to hunker down for the night. However, just as he made his way up the stairs to the first floor, the steady hum of the main generator suddenly stuttered and died, plunging the lighthouse into complete darkness and an eerie silence. His stomach dropped. Aki grabbed a torch and rushed back down to the generator room, a small rectangular building attached to the base of the lighthouse tower. On opening the heavy wooden door, he immediately saw a very specific failure light blinking on the control panel, a clear signal that a crucial part had failed and needed replacing. Aki knew exactly what had gone wrong, a component that, although he had spares, would take hours to replace. There was no way he could fix it now, not with the storm already raging outside. Under the circumstances, he could have easily panicked, but he didn't. Aki had trained for this exact scenario. The solution, though urgent, was very simple. Unplug the main electrical feed wires from the faulty generator and plug them into the backup generator. The wires were connected through a single industrial-sized plug and socket, and all it required was a special wrench tool to unlatch the plug and make the switch. The tool wasn't there. Aki's heart raced. The wrench should have been on the shelf next to the generator, where it always was. Without it, he couldn't disconnect the plug and move it to the backup generator. Aki's chest tightened as he tore through the generator room, pulling drawers open and tossing things aside in the desperate search. The storm now raged outside, the lighthouse still dark, and with every passing second, the situation grew more desperate. Where was that wrench? His breath came faster, his hands shaking. The storm roared louder, and his mind raced with the consequences. This was serious. If the light stayed out, ships could crash against the rocks, and people could die. He stopped for a moment, trying to steady his thoughts. Then from the corner of his eye he saw it, a flicker, a soft, faint glow just at the edge of his vision. Aki froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He blinked hard, his pulse racing. Was he imagining things? But then it flickered again, stronger this time, like a shimmer of light hanging in the air. Fear surged through him. He took a step back, nearly stumbling. What the hell is that? He whispered, half to himself, half to the empty room. The glow wasn't fading. If anything, it was becoming more distinct, more solid, like an apparition. He swallowed hard, his heart hammering as he watched this faintly glowing presence slowly drift away from him. His instinct screamed to turn away, to run, but something kept him rooted in place. The apparition wasn't threatening, but its very presence unsettled him deeply. Aki's breath caught in his throat. The glow hovered for a moment, pulsing faintly as if waiting for him. Then with slow, deliberate movement, it floated further away. It didn't flicker away or vanish into the walls like a trick of the light. It lingered at the bottom of the stairs, lingering long enough for him to understand, It's showing me something. The thought planted itself in his mind, unbidden but undeniable. The glow paused again, then drifted once more, now ascending slightly, as though beckoning him to follow it up the stairs. Aki's heart hammered in his chest. His instinct screamed to turn back, but something about this soft pulsing light made him hesitate. The way it moved. It wasn't random. It had a purpose. Was it guiding him? The glow pulsed a little brighter, as if in response, its path clear now. Aki hesitated, torn between the fear clawing at his chest and the desperate need to get the lighthouse working again. If this thing, whatever it was, could help him, he had no choice but to follow. Shakily, Aki took a tentative step forward, then another, and another, his eyes never leaving the strange, glowing form. It drifted forward, gliding up the stairs to the living quarters. The wind howled louder against the windows, and Aki's pulse raced in time with it. He could barely hear his own thoughts over the storm and his rising inner fear and panic. As he climbed the stairs, he couldn't shake the eerie sensation crawling up his spine. What was this thing? Why was it here? The glowing apparition led him to the kitchen. There, it stopped on the windowsill of the little window, hovering for a moment, suddenly glowing brighter, before fading away into nothing. Aki's eyes darted around the window area, looking for the strange thing that was now nowhere to be seen, and then he saw it, a special wrench, lying on the windowsill as though it had been waiting for him all along. His hands trembled as he picked it up, staring at the very spot where the glow had vanished. He felt a rush of deep unease, and despite the storm raging outside, the room felt eerily silent. Something had guided him, something he couldn't explain. And for the first time, Aki wasn't so sure he was alone on this island. With the wrench in his hand, Aki quickly descended the stairs, back to the generator room. His fingers trembled as he worked, disconnecting the main feed from the faulty generator and switching it to the backup. It wasn't difficult. It was a task he'd practiced dozens of times during the daytime, but after what had just happened, the normalcy of it all felt oddly jarring. The backup generator effortlessly rumbled to life, filling the room with its steady hum. The lighthouse flickered back to life, its bright life-saving beam once again slicing through the storm. Immense relief washed over Aki as he realized the danger had passed. The ships out at sea would see the light and steer clear of the rocks. His job for now was done. Aki stood there for a moment, the wrench still in his hand, staring at the blinking lights of the control panel. His heart was still racing, not from the urgency of fixing the generator, but from the strangeness of what had just occurred. That thing, whatever it was, had led him directly to the wrench. He glanced back toward the stairs, half expecting to see the faint glow again. But there was nothing, just the silent lighthouse and the storm still raging outside. What was that? He whispered to himself. His voice sounded small in the empty room. Part of him wanted to believe it was just the stress of the moment, his mind playing tricks on him. But deep down he knew that wasn't true. Aki shook his head, trying to shake off the lingering unease. With the lighthouse functioning again, Aki felt the tension in his body begin to ease, but the lingering unease of the apparition stuck with him. He placed the wrench back on the shelf where it should have been all along. He stared at it for a long moment, half expecting it to vanish again, but of course it didn't. The strange glow was gone, the storm still raging outside, but the interior of the lighthouse was once again illuminated, bathed in the familiar hum of power. He climbed the stairs to the living quarters, his thoughts swirling, and sat down at the small table by the window, looking out at the churning sea. The wind howled, and the rain streaked across the glass, but the danger was over, for now. Aki sighed heavily, trying to make sense of what had happened. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion settling over him in waves. "Maybe I imagined it," he muttered, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew this was not his imagination. Something really had been there. Resting his forehead on the table, Aki let the steady rhythm of the storm lull him into a kind of numbness. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind, the glow, the way it had led him to the wrench, and how it had felt more like a gentle presence than a threat. "I'm not alone here," he whispered, the realization settling like a weight in his chest. The thought wasn't comforting, though. It gnawed at him, stirring fears and uncertainties. Until now, life on the island had been simple, peaceful, a sanctuary from the world that had always been too loud and too cruel. But now the island felt different, alive in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time since arriving, Aki felt a pang of doubt. He made his way back upstairs to the living quarters, glancing out the small window as he climbed. The storm was relentless, the wind howling like a living thing determined to claw its way inside. Even if the storm weren't raging, the events of the night swirled in his mind, the sudden failure, the missing wrench, the strange apparition that had guided him. His thoughts were a tangled mess of questions and unease. Reaching his bed, he sat down heavily, Momo resting against the pillow where he'd left it. He longed to curl up beneath the blankets and shut out the world for a few hours, but he knew his racing mind wouldn't let him sleep. The storm rattled the windows, each gust a fresh reminder of the tension in the air. "No point even trying," he muttered to himself, glancing at the clock. It was long after midnight. He rubbed his eyes and stood up, pacing the small room. His thoughts kept circling back to the generator. The backup was running, but Aki knew he would be much more comfortable with the main generator fixed. It still needed the broken part replaced, a job that would take hours. It wasn't particularly urgent. He could wait until morning. But with his mind refusing to quiet, Aki knew he needed something to focus on. Decision made, Aki slipped on his repair overalls and headed back down the stairs. The sound of the wind seemed to dull as he descended deeper into the lighthouse, the hum of the backup generator a steady comfort in the background. He flipped open his logbook and scanned the repair instructions. It was going to be a long job, an all-nighter, but that was exactly what he needed right now. A distraction. With a sigh, Aki set to work. The storm would likely rage all night, but here, in the quiet hum of the generator room, he could find a small sense of control. When the storm eventually passed, it was dawn. The island was left in an eerie silence. The generator repair was now more than half complete, but Aki decided to give himself a break and cautiously ventured outside. His boots squelched in the rain-soaked earth. The air was thick with the smell of salt and damp soil. The storm had left its mark. Sea foam and driftwood was strewn across the path. Pools of water glistened in every hollow, and the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. He wandered down to the shore near the jetty, the waves still churning from the aftermath of the storm. The sea looked angry, its surface rough and dark, but Aki felt strangely drawn to it. As he walked further, he found his thoughts returning once again to the apparition. Could it really have been a trick of the light? A product of his exhaustion? The logical part of him wanted to believe that, but the deeper, more instinctual part of him knew better. Whatever it was, it had been real, and it had helped him. For now there were no answers, only questions. Aki eventually turned and headed back toward the lighthouse, his steps slow and deliberate, the weight of the island pressing down on him. But despite the strangeness of the night, one thing was certain. He wasn't alone here. And that knowledge, comforting or not, changed everything. Chapter 5. Emerging Benevolence. By the time Aki returned to the lighthouse, the sun had already begun climbing into the sky, casting long rays of light over the wet landscape. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, his body aching from the stress of the night before. He hadn't slept in over 24 hours, but the generator repair still needed to be completed, although he could have got some sleep and finished it later. A quiet stubbornness inside insisted he finish the job first. Besides, he questioned whether he would even be able to sleep yet, despite his growing fatigue. His mind was still a blur, numb from everything that had happened. Aki moved with sluggish determination back into the generator room. As the morning wore on, his fatigue deepened, and every movement felt heavier than the last. But he pressed on, determined to get the lighthouse fully functional again. By the time the generator was fixed, it was almost noon. With a heavy sigh of relief, Aki wiped his oil-smudged brow and set his tools aside. He had done it, but the weight of exhaustion was now pulling him down fast. His body and mind ached for sleep, and now that the urgent repairs were over, he finally allowed himself the luxury of being able to relax, with a soothing hot shower, and then some rest. After his shower, Aki barely made it to his bed before collapsing onto it. With Momo tucked under his arm, he tiredly pulled the covers over himself and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, dragging Aki into a deep, dream-filled slumber. He was back in the cafe from the city, surrounded by familiar sights and sounds. The clinking of cups, the low hum of voices. Everything was exactly as it had been, but there was no rush, no tension, only peace. As he stood there in the dream, Aki felt something soft brush against his ears, a gentle caress, light and soothing. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in a while, reminiscent of the kind touches from cafe patrons who used to pet his ears with innocent curiosity. But this felt different, softer, more deliberate. A warmth spread through him, soothing him, lulling him deeper into the dream. He leaned into the sensation, letting it wash over him like a wave of comfort. It was so calming, so safe, like someone was taking care of him. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the dream began to fade. Aki stirred, his eyes fluttering open as he returned to consciousness. He lay there for a moment, caught between the soft embrace of sleep and the waking world. His ears twitched slightly, still remembering the soothing feeling of them being gently caressed. Slowly he sat up, rubbing his eyes. The light streaming through the window told him it was late afternoon. The storm had cleared, leaving the island bathed in a soft, golden glow. Aki had managed to doze for a few hours, but was still not fully rested. He stretched, his body stiff from both the repair work and the general deficit of proper sleep. As he shifted, his gaze fell to the bedside table, and there, resting next to his alarm clock, was his friendship bracelet. His breath caught in his throat. The bracelet, the one he thought he had lost somewhere outside during the storm last night, was now lying right in front of him. He picked it up slowly, turning it over in his hands. It was dry, clean, almost as if it had never left his wrist at all. Aki's mind raced. He clearly remembered it slipping off his wrist while he was outside and losing it to the deadly rocks. And yet, here it was. His thoughts drifted back to the dream, the gentle caressing of his ears, the feeling of being watched over, cared for, and guided. A shiver ran down his spine as thoughts of the mysterious apparition entered his mind again. Could it have been? He stared at the bracelet for a long moment, trying to make sense of it all. There was no denying it now. Something was there with him. In such an isolated situation, the thought would have unnerved most people, likely driving them to pack their bags and leave immediately. But Aki found himself feeling strangely calm and rational about the whole thing. His thoughts kept circling back to the bracelet. He vividly remembered the moment it had slipped from his wrist and flown over the cliff edge into the deadly rocks below. He had been certain it was gone for good, swallowed by the chaos of the night. Yet, when he'd woken to find it placed gently by his bedside, something powerful had stirred within him. It wasn't just the return of the bracelet. It was the way it had been returned, clean and dry, as if by something or someone that cared. As he tightened his grip on the bracelet, he couldn't help but reflect. This presence, whatever it was, had only ever helped him, and despite his trepidation and the endless questions swirling in his mind, he didn't feel the urge to flee, not yet. He didn't know who or what this presence was, but one thing was becoming clear. It meant him no harm. Chapter 6. Echoes of the Self. The days following the big storm passed quietly. Aki had repaired the generator, the light was shining brightly once more, and life on the island had settled back into its usual rhythm. Yet something had shifted. The island felt more alive somehow, and while the apparition hadn't appeared since that stormy night, Aki still continued to sense its presence occasionally, an awareness lingering just beyond his reach. At first, Aki found the sensation unnerving, but over time he noticed that the unease he'd felt for whatever this was had been replaced by a slightly more settled feeling, and although Aki still had no explanation for what it was, it caused a small part of him to feel less alone. One afternoon, while tending to the lighthouse, he felt its presence again, that tingling sensation at the back of his neck. He stopped mid-task, staring out at the horizon. The sea was calm, the sky clear, but something was different. Aki's ears twitched in response, though the air remained still. He shook his head, brushing off the odd feeling, and returning to his work, polishing the lens of the lighthouse. The task was soothing, its rhythm calming his restless thoughts. But just as he was finishing, he caught a flicker of light in his periphery, ethereal, faint, just at the edge of his vision. Aki froze. Slowly he turned, and there it was again, the soft glow hovering near the staircase, the shapeless apparition. This time, Aki felt no fear, only a calm curiosity. He watched the glow linger, waiting for him. It pulsed gently, as if beckoning him to follow. With a steadying breath, Aki descended the stairs, the glow leading him deeper into the lighthouse. Each step felt purposeful, the air thick with anticipation, but Aki remained calm. The presence had only ever helped him, and he trusted it now. As they reached the ground floor, the apparition floated silently into the generator room, its light pulsing faintly. Aki stopped at the doorway, peering into the dimly lit room, and there, in the soft glow, he saw the apparition's form intensify and intentionally change shape. The once faint outline was now much clearer, much more defined. It was no longer just a formless light, but had coalesced into something unsettlingly familiar, the ghostly form of a human. And there, atop its head, were two faint glowing shapes. Ears, Neko ears. Aki's heart skipped a beat. The apparition wasn't just a random spirit, it was like him, a Neko. For a long moment, Aki simply stared. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Why did it look like him? Why had it revealed this now? Before he could gather his thoughts, the glow flickered again, as if sensing his confusion. It began to fade, but just before it disappeared, Aki heard something, a soft whisper, like the wind brushing against his ears. He strained to hear it, but the sound was gone, and with it, The apparition. Aki stood in the empty room, his heart still racing. The Neko ears, the whisper, everything felt deliberate, as if the apparition was trying to tell him something. But what? Aki didn't have the answers yet, but deep down he could feel there was more to come, more to be uncovered. Returning to finish his lens polishing, Aki's mind continued churning over with new, even deeper questions. He tried to push them aside and focus, but that image of the humanoid apparition, especially those Neko ears, kept crashing back into his thoughts, loud and insistent, refusing to be ignored. It all meant something. That night, Aki stood by the main light, gazing through the lantern panes, staring out at the endless sea. The beam of the lighthouse swept across the dark water, steady and unwavering, but Aki's reflection in the glass drew his attention. For the first time, a thought crossed his mind. What if the apparition wasn't just a presence? What if it was something more? Something connected directly to him? He turned away from the window, his footsteps echoing softly as he descended the stairs. The unease had faded somewhat, but the curiosity lingered, stronger than ever. As Aki lay in bed, the lighthouse's soft glow sweeping across the room, his thoughts kept returning back to the apparition. There were still so many questions, too many pieces that didn't fit together. He needed answers about the island, about the spirit, and about why it felt so directly tied to him. He had no idea what the truth would reveal, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't rest until he found out. Chapter 7. A Growing Connection. The days stretched on, each one marked by the steady routines of lighthouse life. Aki had grown used to the solitude, finding comfort in the quiet moments between his duties. But ever since that stormy night when the apparition helped him find the wrench, something had shifted. He wasn't alone here, and the realization left him with more questions than answers. The sense of being watched, of a presence lingering just beyond his sight, was no longer unsettling. In fact, it felt strangely comforting, yet also deliberate, like the island or something on it was trying to tell him something. He thought often about the Neko ears he had seen on the apparition. There was no mistaking them, soft, pointed, and unmistakably familiar. Aki couldn't help but wonder whether this entity was connected to him somehow. And if so, how? These thoughts were constantly there, playing out in the back of his mind, consuming him, especially during his routine tasks. One particularly calm day, Aki was cleaning the lens at the top of the lighthouse. He wiped the glass with slow, methodical strokes, but his mind wasn't on the task. It was elsewhere, churning over the strange occurrences that had begun to unfold since that big storm. In the evenings, Aki had taken to reading the journals left behind by previous lighthouse keepers. Weathered, old logs filled with mundane details of storms, ship sightings and repairs. But every now and then he'd stumble upon cryptic mentions of strange things, vague references to odd sensations or unexplained noises, but never anything detailed, never anything like what he had been experiencing, and none of them had mentioned anything about Neko ears. That realization troubled him. If this apparition had been here for so long, why had no one written about it in detail? Why was it appearing to him, and why now? Suddenly, as he polished the glass, a soft rustling sound pulled him from his thoughts. Aki turned, heart quickening, but there was nothing there. The lantern room was still, but the sensation persisted. If anything, it was stronger now. He felt a subtle shift in the air, a cool breath against his skin, like a hand lightly brushing past his arm. The feeling was so tangible it made his ears twitch. Aki held his breath, freezing in place within the tower's vast emptiness. The apparition was close. He could feel it. But what did it want? Why was it drawing nearer? Instead of panic, Aki felt a growing sense of determination. Whatever this entity was, it wasn't here to scare him. He'd realized that part at least. He figured it was reaching out, trying to communicate in its own way, and he needed to understand what it was trying to tell him. For a long moment, Aki stood perfectly still, offering the entity an opportunity to do whatever it was trying to do. He was no longer afraid, not really. There was mild trepidation as he felt a faint warmth and tingling sensation on his arm again, but he just remained still, listening, sensing, watching, hoping something more of the mystery might be revealed. But after a few moments, the sensation slowly ebbed away, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the lighthouse and the distant crash of the waves below. Yet something had shifted. The presence felt more intimate now, as though it had drawn closer. But for reasons unknown, either by choice or design, it wasn't ready or able to reveal more. Aki finished his tasks for the day with a renewed sense of purpose. His recent encounter with the apparition had sparked something in him, a drive to keep searching for answers. His thoughts drifted back to the old Lighthouse logbooks he had been slowly working through over the past few weeks. He had only made it halfway through the 24 or so volumes, but there was still a chance that the answers he sought lay hidden within those weathered pages. With the lantern glass now polished and his chores complete, Aki descended the narrow staircase. Later, with a steaming cup of tea in hand and a small stack of logbooks beside him, he settled into the small living room. The familiar hum of the lighthouse surrounded him, a soothing backdrop as he opened one of the journals. The logbooks had become his quiet companions in these solitary moments, and now, more than ever, he was determined to find anything that could shed light on the mystery surrounding the apparition. Aki pulled an old dusty logbook from the stack on the table, one he hadn't read before. The pages were yellowed and worn, the handwriting fading in places, but the entries were meticulous. He flipped through the pages, scanning the daily accounts of weather patterns, ship sightings, and maintenance tasks. But then, scattered among the routine, he noticed something different. Short, cryptic mentions of unusual phenomena. Saw faint light on the water again today. Not sure what it is. Happens too often to ignore. Aki frowned, his heart beginning to quicken. He flipped to another entry, this one even more cryptic. Wrench went missing during repairs. Searched everywhere. No luck. A strange light appeared and led me to it. Found it in a spot it shouldn't have been. Wouldn't have found it otherwise. Odd. Aki's heart raced as he read the entry, the eerie similarity to his own experience sending a chill through him. He turned the pages faster now, eyes scanning each brief log entry. Many hinted at the same strange and mysterious idea that something had been watching over this lighthouse for a long time, from long before he ever arrived. Aki leaned back in his chair, staring down at the old logbooks. The entity. It had been here, helping lighthouse keepers for far longer than anyone realized. Mentions of it varied among the keepers. Some were vocal about it, others barely acknowledged it, and a few didn't mention it at all. But one thing was becoming undeniably clear. The entity, this presence, wasn't new. It had been guiding them all along, and from what Aki could conclude, it had been quietly responsible for keeping both the lighthouse and its keepers safe, out of harm's way, and sane. Aki sat back, feeling a deepening connection to the island and the lighthouse. The presence wasn't just watching, it was tied to the very essence of the lighthouse, intertwined with its long history. And now, Aki understood it was also attempting to guide him, just as it had guided those before him. As the evening drew in, Aki closed the logbook he was reading and let out a long breath. The weight of the day's discoveries pressed against his mind, but there was a strange comfort in knowing he wasn't the first to have experienced this mystery, and to read fairly conclusively that the entity's presence wasn't a threat, but was a silent guardian and protector. He stood up and made his way up the narrow staircase toward the lantern room. The soft creak of the steps was familiar, almost comforting, as he climbed higher. When he reached the top, the view took his breath away. The island was bathed in the quiet blue glow of a full moon, the cliffs and the ocean stretching out before him under a vast, star-filled sky. Aki leaned against the window railing, gazing out over the endless waves and the soft rise of the land below. The lighthouse beam swept across the sea, its steady rhythm a reminder of the quiet duty that bound him to this place. But tonight, the uncertainty that had been with him these past days seemed lighter. The strange presence was still there somewhere, guiding him in ways he was only just beginning to understand. He had been so focused on the questions, on the mysteries of the island and the apparition, but now there was a new feeling beneath it all, a calmness amidst the determination to learn more. He was starting to see the path ahead unfold, and though the answers weren't clear yet, Aki knew he was ready to face whatever came next. He lingered for a few minutes longer, letting the peace of the moonlit island settle over him, before finally heading down to his quarters. As he climbed into bed, Momo clutched to his chest. Aki allowed his mind to wander briefly to the mysteries still ahead of him. But as his eyes grew heavy, the anticipation for tomorrow stirred gently in his heart, a quiet reminder that the island's secrets were still waiting to be uncovered, one step at a time. Tomorrow would bring another day, and with it, another chance to understand more. Chapter 8. A glimpse into the past. The days passed with a newfound calm. The lighthouse, with its steady hum and rhythmic beam cutting through the night, felt more like home than ever. Aki moved through his daily routine with a clearer mind, the earlier tension slowly giving way to a feeling of acceptance. Whatever the apparition was, he didn't feel the same urgent need to chase it down. He trusted that when it was ready to reveal more of its mysteries again, it would. One evening, as the light outside began to fade, Aki found himself feeling unusually content. The soft whirring of the generator, the glow of the lanterns, it all felt peaceful. The air inside the lighthouse was warm and comfortable, and the island seemed to hum with its own gentle energy. Aki prepared for bed, settling under the blankets, Momo tucked securely under his arm and closed his eyes. Sleep came to him easily that night. However, the dream that followed was very vivid, almost too real, and rather unsettling. Aki found himself standing on the beach near the jetty, the gentle waves lapping at the shore. The wind brushed against his ears, cool and familiar, though the sky overhead felt slightly off, too close, as if it were pressing down, although not in a threatening way. Then, just at the edge of his vision, he saw it. A faint glow. Aki's pulse quickened. Slowly he turned toward the light. There it was, the ghostly humanoid apparition. Hovering just above the beach, its Neko ears again unmistakable, glowing faintly in the soft light. This time the figure was even clearer, its tail swaying gently, its form outlined more distinctly against the darkness. Aki stood still. He could feel his heart pulsing in his chest, although more from anticipation than fear this time. The slightly nervous edge was there, but it was rooted more in curiosity. The apparition didn't look exactly like him. Its features were still hazy, but something about it stirred a deep sense of familiarity within him. The figure floated closer, moving slowly, deliberately. Aki's pulse pounded in his ears as the apparition came to a stop just a few feet away, its glowing eyes, now more visible, locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them moved. The apparition raised its hand, pointing toward the horizon, and before Aki could react, the world shifted around him. He was no longer on the beach. Suddenly he was back in the city, the noise of distant traffic replaced by an eerie silence. The cold, shadowy alleyway he recognized all too well stretched out before him. His heart sank. This was a place he had long tried to forget. At the far end of the alley stood his younger self, barely more than a boy, cornered by two figures. Human figures, larger and more menacing in the dim light. One of them grabbed young Aki by the collar, slamming him roughly against the wall. The other sneered, his words sharp and cruel. "Stupid Nekos, you really think anyone's going to care if something happens to you? No one cares about worthless mutts like you." The words hit Aki like a punch, the memory rushing back with brutal force. He remembered every detail, how he had felt the rough stone wall at his back, how his legs had gone weak with fear, how his heart had pounded in his chest, and how he had felt alone. So utterly alone. The first shove was followed by a punch, square in the stomach, and young Aki doubled over onto the ground, gasping for air, his ears flat against his head in submission. The pain surged through him, sharp and unforgiving, while the attackers laughed. His tail curled defensively around his leg, but it did nothing to protect him. Worst of all, people walked by at the mouth of the alley, glancing in for a moment before continuing on, indifferent to the violence happening just feet away. No one helped. No one even slowed down. Aki's breath quickened as he watched the scene of his memory playing out in front of him. His chest tightened with the same fear he had felt back then, but now it was mixed with helplessness. He couldn't move, couldn't do anything to stop it. It was like living it all over again, only this time he was forced to watch. The now familiar soft glow appeared at the edge of the alley and moved closer. Aki turned, his pulse still racing. The Neko apparition was there, standing beside him, watching silently. Aki saw its cat ears twitch slightly and then flatten against its head, as if in empathy with the younger Catboy's situation. It looked at him with a gentle, almost sorrowful expression. Aki's voice trembled as he spoke, struggling to keep steady. "I don't understand. Why are you making me see this again? Why do I have to relive this?" Aki's chest ached with the weight of the memory. "I know this happened," he gasped, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't need to see it again." The emotions surged within him, frustration and sorrow mingling as he stared at his younger self, broken and beaten in that alleyway. He had spent years trying to forget this moment, but here it was, dredged up again. The apparition had forced him to relive it, and he couldn't fathom why. Then, just as he was about to turn away, the apparition's glow pulsed softly. It wasn't forceful, but gentle, a faint flicker, as if urging him to look closer, to see something he hadn't understood before. Aki hesitated, his breath catching, and then it hit him. This memory. It wasn't just one painful moment in his past. It had shaped him, more than he'd ever realized. He had buried it so deep, convinced himself it didn't matter. But the truth was, it had colored everything. The distrust, the self-doubt, the feeling of inadequacy and being less than worthless. All of it had solidified here, in this alley. He had been carrying this weight with him ever since. Every decision, every moment of feeling small and insignificant, traced back to this. It had planted a seed of hopelessness, one that had grown roots deep inside him, silently shaping his life from that moment onwards. The apparition's glow brightened again, a subtle but clear affirmation. Aki blinked, the realization settling over him. "This is where it all started, isn't it?" he whispered. "This moment. This is when I stopped trusting anyone. I stopped trusting or believing in myself. I couldn't do anything," Aki whispered, his voice barely audible. "No one helped me." The apparition didn't speak, but its presence was enough. It didn't need to. The truth was plain now. It moved closer to him, its glow brightening slightly, as if urging him to continue. "You're not showing me this to torment me or make me suffer. I realize that," Aki continued, his voice quiet but steadier. "I think you're showing me this because I've been running from it all this time. I never faced it, and I can't move on until I do." The weight of the memory suddenly felt different. He wasn't just reliving it. He was confronting it, acknowledging its power over him for the first time. And with that acknowledgement came a small, flickering sense of freedom. Tears blurred his vision, and Aki blinked them away. The emotions he had pushed down for so long rising to the surface. Anger, fear, shame. It was all there, raw and painful. The apparition stayed close, its soft glow lighting the shadowed alley. It didn't need to say anything. Aki understood now. His voice was quiet but steady as he spoke. "I think I understand. You're trying to help me. Help me move past this, to heal from it, aren't you?" The glow pulsed gently, as if in affirmation, and the alley began to dissolve. The cold brick walls melted away into light, and the figures who had tormented him faded into the darkness. Soon, Aki stood alone in the dreamscape, his younger self gone, but the memory still there, lingering, but no longer as sharp. The scene shifted again. This time, Aki found himself back in the cafe from the city, standing amidst the soft clinking of cups and the low murmur of voices. The warm, familiar scent of coffee filled the air, and the gentle hum of conversation buzzed around him. But the comfort that should have come with this memory was clouded by a different kind of tension. Aki glanced around, and the familiarity of it all felt too real. The polished wooden tables, the patrons laughing, and the gentle sound of a bell at the door. Yet there was an undercurrent of unease, a shadow lingering just beneath the surface. He saw his younger self again, this time wiping down a table as the cafe bustled with activity. But even through the noise, Aki could hear a few distinct voices, mocking, sharp, and cutting through the warmth like a cold wind. "Look at his ears," one voice said, laughing. "And that tail. He's like a giant rat." "Probably just as filthy, too," came another voice from the same table, cruel amusement in their tone. Aki's younger self flinched at the words, though he tried to hide it, his ears twitching slightly. He kept his eyes down, focusing on his work, trying to block out the taunts. But the comments grew louder, crueler, like a chorus of mockery that filled areas of the cafe. As Aki watched the scene unfold, he remembered this day well. The manager and other staff had all gone out on their breaks, and he was left running the cafe alone. Just then, a customer slammed their mug down on the table, making the younger Aki jump. The man, heavy-set and red-faced, glared at Aki with open disdain. "Hey, Catboy!" he barked, his voice loud enough to make heads turn. "What's the point of having ears like that if you can't even listen properly? I said no sugar." Aki's younger self quickly hurried forward, hands trembling as he stammered an apology. I'm so sorry, sir. I'll fix it right away." But the man wasn't finished. He stood up, towering over the younger Aki. The man spoke angrily. "Fix it. You've already messed it up.
Why do they even hire freaks like you? Can't even do a simple job right.
The cafe seemed to go quieter as the man's words hung in the air, drawing attention from others. Aki's younger self shrank under the weight of the insult, his tail flicking anxiously and his ears flattening against his head as his cheeks burned with shame. A small group of other patrons started murmuring from another table, some snickering, while a few others whispered to each other, their eyes never leaving the scene. The man sneered down at Aki. I bet you think you're cute, don't you? With those stupid ears and tail? But you're not. You're just another stupid flea-bitten Neko who's only good for doing the shitty jobs no one else is dumb enough to do. Aki's hands trembled as he reached for the mug to take it back to the counter. His head bowed low, not daring to look the man in the eyes. The humiliation was suffocating, a familiar, crushing weight that he had endured too many times before. But as he turned to go, the man grabbed Aki's tail, yanking on it hard. Aki screeched in pain, stumbling as the force of the violent tug sent an excruciating jolt through his spine, causing him to tumble to the floor, spilling the mug of hot coffee over himself. Half the cafe erupted in laughter. Aki's younger self froze, his body stiff with fear and humiliation, as well as the burning sensation from the hot liquid now soaking through his clothing. He could feel the eyes of people on him, their laughter a cruel reminder that, to them, he wasn't a person, just a thing, a source of amusement. Their indifference was as cutting as the act itself. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. Tears stung the young Catboy's eyes as he grovelled on the floor, helpless, feeling the weight of their cruel mockery. No one stood up for him. No one told the man to stop. It was just another day in the city, a place where Neko like him, it seemed, were little more than objects for humiliation and abuse. Aki's heart raced as he watched the dreadful scene unfolding before him. He remembered this moment like it was yesterday, the humiliation, the helplessness, how he had simply accepted it, brushing it off because he thought that was the only way to survive it. He watched as his younger self got up and hurried to the counter to fetch the man's replacement coffee, keeping his head down, his ears flat against his head. With the manager and staff still out, no one came to his defence. No one stopped the cruel mocking. He was just an oddity, different, a curiosity, and that's all he had ever been to them. Even inside his own dream, Aki's breath felt tight in his throat. The pain in his heart was real, raw and undeniable. He had lived through this and other moments like it time and again, telling himself it didn't matter, that it was just an inevitable part of his life. But now, seeing it from the outside, he couldn't ignore the truth. It really did matter. The bustling cafe scene before him then seemed to freeze, like somebody hitting pause on a video, and Aki was left standing there, the apparition beside him glowing softly, its presence now feeling like a quiet comfort amidst the hurt. Why did I put myself in a position to be treated like that? Aki whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the question. He had never fought back, not because he didn't want to or didn't know how to, but because he simply couldn't. Neko were fragile, considerably weaker than humans. They weren't built to fight. Most Neko knew that resisting during such circumstances would have likely only made things worse and far more dangerous for them. Violence against Neko was a daily reality, and most had learnt the hard way that fighting back only escalated the cruelty. Neko always came off far worse if they resisted it. The apparition didn't respond with words, but it didn't need to. Its glow pulsed gently, as if encouraging him to continue, to confront the truth he had buried so deeply. Aki swallowed hard, his mind racing. I thought if I just stayed quiet, if I didn't draw attention to myself, the bullying would stop. I thought that was the only way to survive. The truth of his own words stung him. It had never worked. The more he had tried to disappear and stay under the radar, the more they had noticed him. The more passive he had been, the more power and aggression they had exerted over him. And yet, like all Neko, he had no choice. Neko simply couldn't fight back. They were naturally small, weak, timid, and gentle-natured, leaving them so vulnerable in a world that often made them feel like little more than prey. They really were completely at the mercy of the whims of their more powerful human cousins. He felt the shame of it washing over him, not because he hadn't fought back, but because he had let their cruelty seep into him. He had allowed himself to believe that he was worthless, that he deserved to be treated that way. And for what? For survival? For the hope that maybe, if he was compliant enough, they would leave him alone? The apparition remained by his side, its presence steady and unwavering. It didn't judge him for his past, for his inability to fight back. It understood. Aki could feel that. He realized this wasn't about changing his nature. It was about changing how he saw himself and how he let these experiences shape him. "I never belonged there in the city," Aki said softly, the realization settling over him like a weight lifting from his chest. "No Neko does." He began to realize the city, the cafe, and other establishments where he'd worked had all been more than just a place of work. They had been places where his inability to defend himself against humans, his very Neko nature, had been exploited. And now, standing here in the dream, he understood why it had hurt so much. It wasn't just the words or the actions. It was the way they had made him feel so powerless. Like he didn't matter. Like he wasn't a person, but a thing to be ruled over and exploited. The realization stung, but it was also freeing in a way. He had spent so long trying to belong in a world that had never really valued him, a world that had always seen him as different, as an outsider and as weak. And here on this island with the apparition at his side, Aki felt the beginnings of something shift inside him. He didn't have to try to belong there anymore. The apparition turned its gentle eyes toward him, its form seeming now more visible than ever, its presence warm, understanding. Aki could sense the weight of his past lifting slowly but surely. The emotions he had buried for so long began to rise to the surface, and as he faced them, he could feel their grip on him weakening, almost in real time. "I think I understand now," Aki whispered. The apparition pulsed softly in response, as if affirming his words. Its glow brightened for a moment, and Aki felt a warmth and a strange calmness settle over him. It was as if the presence was reassuring him, telling him that he was on the right path, that he was finally beginning to see the truth. The cafe dissolved into light, and Aki was left standing in the dreamscape once more, now on the lighthouse lamp balcony at night, the vastness of the moonlit island stretching out before him. The apparition remained beside him, silent but present, its form a comforting confirmation that he wasn't alone in this journey. When Aki awoke, the soft light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the small window, along with the familiar rhythmic pulses from the rotating lighthouse beam. For a moment, he lay still, letting the lingering images of the dream swirl in his mind. Normally his dreams faded quickly when morning came, slipping away like mist. But this one clung to him. He could still feel the emotions, raw and vivid, as if the dream had somehow reached into the darkest corners of his memory and pulled those horrible moments to the surface. Aki's chest tightened as he recalled the alley, the cafe, the helplessness, things he had tried so hard to forget. Sitting up slowly, he rubbed his eyes, trying to make sense of it. His mind replayed the dream over and over. It had felt so real, more real than any dream he could remember. So much so that it made him ponder other ideas. Was it really just a dream? Or was it something more? Had the apparition found a way to communicate with him through it? Aki's heart beat a little faster at the thought. The entity had always appeared in ways that felt like subtle guidance. But this felt deeper, more purposeful, as though it was intentionally leading him to confront the very things he had spent so long burying. His thoughts lingered on the apparition's presence inside his dream, the way it had stood beside him like a caring friend, silent but reassuring, being there with him, for him, helping him face the moments that had left those deep scars on his heart. As he sat there in the quiet dawn, Aki pondered something slightly profound. If the entity had truly been part of that dream, then it was clearly showing him that the pain he carried, the shame, the fear, the self-doubt, was something he had to confront and deal with. He realized now how much of his life had been shaped by these buried emotions. They hadn't just stayed in the past. They'd followed him, affecting every choice he'd made, every relationship he'd formed, and the way he saw himself. The more he tried to ignore or suppress them, the more these wounds had festered, clouding his thoughts and making him doubt his worth. Only by acknowledging their power over him could he finally begin to heal. He took a deep breath, letting that idea settle in. The dream had been hard, painful even, but he could feel something had shifted inside him. He now felt a flicker of hope and the faintest hint of a taste of freedom. Maybe this was what the entity was trying to show him, assuming it really was the entity in his dream. But even if it wasn't, the realization still remained, regardless. A small, tentative smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. For the first time, he felt like the path forward, though still uncertain, was one he could walk without the same weight of self-doubt. And with that thought, Aki felt the tension of the past days begin to ease, leaving him with the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find peace, not just on the island, but within himself as well. Chapter 9. Revelation. The following days on the island passed in a calm rhythm. Aki found himself more attuned to the little details around him, the sound of the waves crashing softly against the shore, the gentle hum of the generator, the faint creaking of the lighthouse as it stood firm against the winds. He no longer felt so weighed down by his past. Instead, it was as if a layer of fog had lifted, giving him room to breathe, to think. The dreams from the previous night stayed with him, their sharp clarity lingering in his thoughts, like the lighthouse's beam cutting through the dark. They had been unsettling, dredging up old pain, but Aki could sense the shift within himself. For the first time, he wasn't running from those memories anymore. He was learning to face them and understand what they had done to him. As he went about his duties, polishing the glass of the lantern room and checking the equipment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. It was subtle, but undeniable. The island didn't feel as lonely as it once had. The presence of the apparition, though still mysterious, no longer unsettled him. It brought him a sense of calm, as if the island itself was watching over him, guiding him through this journey of healing. The afternoon had fallen into a serene calm, the kind that made the island feel like its own little world, cut off from everything else. Aki moved through the lighthouse with a strange sense of peace, his steps quiet on the floors as the distant hum of the sea filled the air. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't chasing answers or trying to solve the mystery of the apparition. Instead, he was letting himself drift, enjoying the quiet. On the ground floor, glancing at the area beneath the staircase, Aki paused. He hadn't paid much attention to this part of the lighthouse before, mostly because it was cluttered with old, dusty equipment and forgotten supplies. but in the dimming afternoon light, something had caught his eye. There, half hidden behind some old barrels and a disused workbench, he saw a small wooden chest. It looked worn, its surface darkened by time, and the edges of the wood were chipped and weathered. Aki hesitated for a moment. He had never noticed it before. His curiosity stirred, and he carefully moved the barrels aside, clearing a path to the chest. He knelt down, brushing the dust off the lid with his hand. The wood creaked faintly as he opened it, revealing a small jumble of old clothing items and what appeared to be a few worn-out tools. But buried beneath the clutter, something else caught his attention. It was a book, leather-bound and faded, its edges frayed and brittle. Aki's eyes narrowed with curiosity as he carefully pulled it out, his fingers brushing off the dust. It didn't look like any of the other logbooks he had read. This one seemed much older. He carried the book to the living quarters, setting it down on the small table near the kitchen window. The sound of the calm ocean waves outside were breaking softly against the rocks as he sat down, and for a moment he just stared at the book, feeling a sense of anticipation he hadn't expected. This felt different, like something important was waiting to be uncovered. With a deep breath, Aki opened the logbook. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting spidery and uneven. As he turned the first few pages, it became clear that this wasn't just an ordinary logbook. The entries were different from the official detailed records kept by lighthouse keepers. These were more personal logs, less about the day-to-day running of the lighthouse and more about the people who had lived here. And then, a short way through the book, Aki's breath hitched. One of the entries spoke of a light that had appeared to the keeper during the night, hovering just out of reach, flickering like a beacon. Another entry, dated years later, described strange occurrences. A tool misplaced, then found after being led by a strange light. Personal items lost, then suddenly showing up out of nowhere. The similarities to his own experiences sent a chill through Aki. He flipped further, scanning the pages with growing urgency. More keepers had written about it. A presence, something they couldn't fully explain, something that seemed to watch over the lighthouse. Some wrote with a degree of fear, unsure of its intentions. Others, though, had a different, more measured perspective. One entry stood out. It was brief, but it was enough to make Aki's heart race. "It is not here to harm. It is here to help." Aki's mind raced as he flipped through more pages. Each entry seemed to only confirm the same conclusion he had previously come to from reading the other logbooks, but now with even more details. This presence had always been there, watching over the lighthouse, and in particular, nudging the keepers, often helping them when they were in peril or were at their lowest. It wasn't just a part of the lighthouse's history. It was part of its very soul. As Aki continued flipping through the pages of the old logbook, a final passage caught his eye. It wasn't like the others. This one was more reflective, filled with speculation rather than fact. But his heart skipped a beat as he read it. "I cannot bring myself to believe that the lighthouse simply came to life of its own accord. I'm inclined to think that some poor soul, perhaps lost upon the very rocks this light now warns against, lingers here still, determined that no others should suffer the same fate. This is but speculation, but I can think of no other cogent explanation. The presence I have sensed is not malicious. It seems to carry a purpose, to keep the light burning and safeguard those who depend upon it. Perhaps it is a spirit of the sea, or a soul denied peace, staying behind to watch over and protect the keepers of this place. Whatever it may be, I find myself thankful for its quiet company." Aki leaned back, his fingers resting lightly on the page as the weight of those words settled over him. The idea that the apparition, whatever it was, might have originated from a tragedy made sense. It explained the protective nature of the presence, and the way it had guided not just him, but the other keepers as well. The thought stirred something deep within him, a quiet respect for the spirit or soul that had remained behind, ensuring the lighthouse continued to serve its purpose. Maybe, just maybe, this theory held some truth. Perhaps the entity had taken on the role of protector, binding itself to the lighthouse to make sure no one else would face the same fate it had. It was only speculation, but the idea struck a chord with Aki. He sat there for a long time, staring at the words as they blurred before him, his mind buzzing with the implications. He closed the logbook with a soft thud, setting it gently on the table. His heart felt lighter, not because he had all the answers, but because things were starting to make sense. The lighthouse wasn't just a building, it was a protector. Its purpose wasn't limited to warning ships about the treacherous rocks. It looked after those who kept it running, the lighthouse keepers themselves. By guiding and supporting them, it ensured they could continue safeguarding the ships and lives out at sea. As the last light of day faded into twilight, Aki felt the familiar hum of the lighthouse under his feet. The logs had confirmed what he had suspected. This place, this island, was alive in more ways than one. The lighthouse, or rather the resident entity bound to it, really was watching over him, just as it had watched over the others who came before him. And now, with the potential truth laid bare, Aki no longer felt like just a keeper of the light. He was a part of it, bound to its purpose in a much more intimate and meaningful way. Whatever came next, he would face it not alone, but as a part of something greater. Chapter 10. A Light in the Darkness. The days on the island continued in a steady routine, and Aki had noticed another subtle shift in his outlook. The island no longer felt like a place to escape to. It had become more than that now, a place of clarity. Each task he completed, tending to the generator, polishing the lens, checking the logbooks, now felt more purposeful. The solitude he once sought out was no longer just a refuge from the world, but a space where he could finally make sense of it. The revelation from the old logbooks still echoed in his mind. The lighthouse was alive, in a sense. The apparition, whether a spirit, a lost soul, or something else entirely, had a purpose. It wasn't just here to guide ships safely past the treacherous rocks, but to protect those who looked after the light. The realization had been a comfort to Aki, knowing he wasn't truly alone. But now, as he mulled over that knowledge, another thought began to take shape. The island was a sanctuary, not just for the lighthouse, but for him too. Out here, away from the bustling city, the judgments and the threats, he had found something extraordinarily precious to him, a feeling of safety. The lighthouse protected him from the storms, but more importantly, it protected him from the world. The idea was a comfort, but it also stirred a deep unease within him. He couldn't ignore the reality that Neko in the city had no such sanctuary. For them, life was precarious, lived under the constant threat of human intolerance. He had started to realize they were forced to rely on human restraint, tolerance and kindness, which could be as fleeting as it was fickle. For every act of charity, there was cruelty. For every kind smile, there was a sneer or a harsh word. Aki had experienced it all too well. As he stood at the top of the lighthouse one evening, the fading light of the sun casting a golden glow over the sea, Aki thought back to his life in the city. The memory of being cornered in that alley, the helplessness, the vulnerability. It was a feeling he had carried with him for so long. It wasn't just the violence that had left its mark. It was the constant reminder that as a Neko, he didn't belong in a human society. His safety, like that of other Neko, was always at the mercy of their more powerful human counterparts. The lighthouse's light cut through the growing dusk, steady and unwavering. Aki leaned against the railing, watching it sweep over the horizon. The weight of his past felt lighter now, but the questions it left behind still gnawed at him. What if things could be different? What if Neko didn't have to live subject to the fickle restraint and charity of human nature? The thought was absurd at first. How could they? Neko were small, physically weaker than humans, and their nature was generally timid and gentle, one of peace and passivity. But as Aki stood there, the lighthouse humming gently beneath his feet, the thought grew louder in his mind. Perhaps it wasn't about strength. Perhaps it wasn't about fighting back or trying to match humans on their terms. Maybe the answer lay in something else entirely. Aki's mind turned to the lighthouse itself. This structure, built to withstand the fiercest storms, wasn't powerful because of size or force. Its strength came from its purpose, to shine a light, to guide, to protect. The lighthouse didn't fight the sea or resist it. It simply stood firm in the place it belonged, fulfilling its role. It worked in harmony with the elements, showing those at sea the way forward, warning of danger without conflict or struggle. Like the lighthouse, the Neko didn't need to be something they weren't. Their strength wasn't in brute force, but in being true to themselves, free to exist on their own terms, unrestricted, unafraid, and unapologetically themselves. And maybe, just maybe, that was the answer for Neko as well. Aki's heart raced at the thought. Could it be that Neko needed their own lighthouse? A place where they could live, not in the shadow of humans, but with their own purpose, their own strength. A place tailored to their needs, and not to the needs of humans. A place where they didn't have to rely on human restraint to stay safe, but could build a life on their own terms, free from the constant fear of being dominated by a stronger force. Aki descended the stairs from the lantern room, his mind buzzing with new possibilities. The thought of Neko finding their own place, away from the human cities, away from the oppression, was radical, almost unthinkable. But wasn't the lighthouse itself proof that such an idea could work? It stood alone on the island, far from the chaos and oppression of the mainland, yet it was indispensable, its light guiding those in need. He made his way to the living quarters and sat by the small wooden table where the logbooks lay. For a moment he considered reading more, but his thoughts were too tangled. Instead, he gazed out the window at the quiet island bathed in twilight, the ocean beyond calm and endless. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the edges of the old logbook. The lighthouse had given him so much: safety, solitude, the space to heal. But perhaps it had given him something more: clarity. The entity hadn't just guided him through his past for the sake of it. It had shown him the pain he carried so he could let go of it, move beyond it. Now, as he considered his future, he realized that same pain was the key to understanding how to help others of his kind. Aki's mind drifted to the Neko back in the city, those who were still trapped in a cycle of mistreatment and fear. Could they too find a place like this? Could they build a life away from the constant pressure to conform to a world that wasn't made for them? The dream flickered in his mind again. The apparition had shown him his past, yes, but also a glimpse of what might come. It had helped him see that healing wasn't just about facing old wounds, but about forging a new path. The idea that Neko could live apart from humans, in a place where they didn't have to fear daily violence, humiliation or judgment. Perhaps that was the path forward. Not just for him, but for all Neko. But where could such a place exist? Aki felt a pang of uncertainty. The lighthouse, this island, it was perfect for him, but it was also isolated. A single refuge in a vast human-dominated world. There had to be more out there. More places where Neko could live, work and thrive without the shadow of human dominance looming over them. He stood and walked toward the window, looking out over the cliffs. The sea stretched out before him, vast and full of possibilities. Somewhere beyond those waves, there had to be a place for them. A place where Neko could live freely, without the constant threat of being crushed by a world too big and too strong for them to navigate alone. The entity's presence brushed against him again, faint but unmistakable. Aki paused, closing his eyes to focus on the sensation, letting his senses confirm it was truly the apparition. Once he was sure, he simply stood still, allowing the feeling to wash over him. What had once been alarming, when he didn't understand what it was, had now become almost comforting, reassuring, like an old friend come to visit. It felt as though the entity could sense his thoughts, his emotions, as if they were connected on a deeper level. "You've helped me more than I could have ever imagined," Aki whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. "Thank you for showing me the way forward." The entity didn't respond, at least not in words, but Aki felt its warmth linger, like an unspoken promise. He wasn't alone, and he never had been. A deep sense of gratitude welled up inside him, knowing that the presence had been with him every step of the way, offering its quiet guidance when he needed it most. The lighthouse had become his sanctuary, a place where he had found peace and purpose. But now, he realized, it wasn't just his peace that mattered. It was the peace of others like him, who had been wandering in the dark for too long. Aki felt a surge of determination. He didn't have all the answers yet, but that was okay. He was starting to see the way forward, not just for himself, but for the Neko who still suffered under the weight of a world that wasn't built for them and didn't understand them. And perhaps, in time, he would find the answers. For now, it was enough to believe that there was a chance for something new, something better. Aki turned away from the window and made his way to bed. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, his mind buzzed with possibilities, and he felt something stir inside him that had been absent for so long. Hope. Chapter 11. A Keeper's Peace. Final chapter. The sky was still dark when Aki woke, the faintest hint of dawn just beginning to lighten the horizon. The island was quiet, save for the distant hum of the generator and the soft crash of waves against the rocks. He lay there for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the lighthouse as it stood guard over the sea. A strange calm had settled over him, a sense of finality, as if he knew this morning would be different. There were no more dreams to chase, no more questions to torment him. Only the lighthouse, the sea, and the steady rhythm of his duties. Aki rose from bed, pulling on his work clothes with slow, deliberate movements. As he descended the stairs, the air felt lighter, almost welcoming. He paused at the bottom, glancing toward the old logbooks he had spent so many evenings poring over. The words of the past keepers, their quiet revelations, lingered in his mind. They had come to the same conclusion. This lighthouse was more than just a beacon of light for ships. It was alive, with a spirit of its own, and it had been watching over them, just as it watched over him now. He felt it again, the soft, familiar warmth brushing against his arm. The apparition was near again. There was no fear, no uncertainty. Aki knew why it was here. Without a second thought, he made his way back up the stairs to the lantern room. The wind had picked up slightly, gently buffeting against the glass as he stepped inside. He moved toward the window, looking out at the still, dark sea. The first light of dawn was just beginning to creep over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the water. The presence was with him, lingering just behind his shoulder. Aki didn't need to turn around to know it was there. He could feel it, steady, constant, reassuring, watching over him as it always had. But there was something different about this moment. As he stood by the glass, the light of the lantern glowing softly behind him, Aki continued gazing out over the sea. The island had once felt so daunting, so isolating. Now it truly felt like home. The presence lingered, warm and familiar, but it wasn't the same as before. It felt quieter, more distant, as though the entity no longer needed to watch over him so closely. The presence would fade now, its purpose fulfilled, allowing Aki to live more independently. And then, a quiet understanding settled in Aki's mind. The entity had been with him when he needed it most, guiding him through the shadows of his past. But now that he had faced those dark memories and come to terms with them, the entity's constant presence was no longer required. Aki opened his eyes and smiled faintly. The entity would always be a part of the lighthouse, and of him. He knew deep down that if he ever needed its guidance again, it would be there. But for now, they could both rest. The weight of that thought brought a new kind of peace. He had come to this island looking for solitude, for freedom from the world that had scarred him. What he had found was something more, a place where he could heal, where he could belong. The island had been a refuge, but now it felt like something more than that. It was a place where he could finally be at peace with himself. He stood there a moment longer, watching as the sun began to rise over the sea, casting its golden light across the water. The light of the lantern shone steadily beside him, and for the first time, Aki felt like he was truly part of it. The presence flickered again, drawing nearer, and Aki watched as the faint, ghostly form of the apparition began to take shape. Its now very familiar Neko ears twitched slightly, and though its features were still obscured by light, the outline was unmistakable. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The apparition stood quietly beside him, its presence both comforting and bittersweet. Aki's heart ached. He had felt this warmth before, but something was different this time. Something final lingered in the air. He furrowed his brow, searching the apparition's ghostly but kind eyes for some kind of answer, but it remained silent, its soft gaze steady and calm. Aki's breath caught in his throat as a strange realization began to take hold, slow and tentative at first. "What is it?" Aki whispered, almost to himself. "Why does this feel different?" The apparition tilted its head slightly as if to encourage Aki's thoughts. He stood there, the wind softly rustling outside the lantern room, and tried to understand what had changed. Then it dawned on him. This wasn't like the other times. The presence wasn't there to guide him through another moment of uncertainty. It was more than that. The entity's purpose had shifted. The gentle glow of the apparition, the quiet patience in its form. It wasn't here to stay, was it? Aki blinked, the truth slowly settling in his chest. "You're not just visiting, are you?" he murmured, his voice catching. You've come to say goodbye." The entity didn't move, but its soft smile deepened, a silent confirmation. The reality of it hit Aki like a wave, and his heart sank. Part of him wanted to protest, to say he wasn't ready for it to leave. But as he looked into the apparition's eyes, he felt a sense of peace begin to grow. He was ready, even if it hurt to admit it. I don't want you to go," Aki whispered, his voice trembling slightly. The apparition's expression remained gentle, but there was something reassuring in its presence. Aki could feel it, the unspoken promise that he would be okay. that he had what he needed now. Though sadness welled up inside him, Aki knew that the entity had fulfilled its task for now. It had helped him face his past, had shown him the strength he didn't know he possessed, and now it was time for both of them to move on. The apparition remained beside Aki, its soft form glowing faintly in the lantern room. A quiet understanding seemed to pass between them, and Aki felt a wave of emotion welling up inside him, his heart heavy with the weight of goodbye. But then something shifted. The entity's ghostly face softened, a gentle, reassuring smile blooming across its features. There was no need for words. Aki could feel the message it was trying to convey. Without a sound, the apparition reached up, its hand moving with a tender slowness, and gently it began to caress Aki's ears. Aki closed his eyes, feeling the soft, familiar touch as if it were real. The gesture wasn't just one of farewell. It was a silent reassurance, a promise that he would be okay, that he had found the strength he needed. Aki's breath steadied, and when he opened his eyes, he saw that the apparition was still smiling at him, its presence warm and comforting. He felt a quiet understanding settle into his heart, as if the entity was telling him that it was time to let go, time for Aki to continue on his own. The apparition's form began to fade, its smile lingering for just a moment longer, before it slowly dissolved into the soft morning light. Aki stood there, watching as the ghostly figure gradually vanished, leaving only the faintest trace of warmth in the air. Though his heart ached with the sadness of farewell, Aki felt a new kind of peace taking its place. The entity might no longer be visible, but its presence, its guidance, would always be with him. And as Aki stood there in the quiet lantern room, he understood that he would be just fine. Aki turned away from the window and walked slowly back down the stairs. As he descended, he thought of the old logbooks, the stories of the keepers who had come before him. Their words had led him to this moment, to this understanding, and now he was ready to start leaving his own mark in the logbook, to write his own chapter in the history of the lighthouse. He sat at the small wooden table, the logbook open before him. His pen hovered above the page, the words already forming in his mind. The lighthouse is alive. It always has been. It watches over those who come here, guiding them as surely as it guides the ships at sea. I understand now. Its purpose is not just to protect the ships that pass by, but to protect us, the keepers. In doing so, it protects itself and countless others. I have seen its spirit, felt its benign presence, and I know I am not alone here. He paused, looking up at the soft light flickering above him, then smiled faintly as more thoughts came to him. The idea of this spirit is otherworldly, yes, but it is also a gift. I can't help but feel grateful for its presence, for the ways it has guided me and helped me to heal. It hasn't just made me a better keeper. It has made me more aware of myself, my strengths, my scars, and my place here. The lighthouse looks after me, and in return, I look after it. Aki paused again, resting the pen lightly on the page. There was more to say, much more, but this felt like enough for now. There was no rush. He would come back to this when the time felt right. He closed the logbook gently, a quiet sense of contentment settling over him. The island had come to mean something so much more than he could have ever expected. It wasn't just a place of solitude. It was where he had found clarity, peace, and perhaps even a sense of purpose. Aki felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Just as the lighthouse stood firm against the fiercest storms, so too would Archie, rooted in the knowledge of who he was and where he belonged. As the dawn gave way to morning, Archie stepped outside, the fresh sea breeze filling his lungs. He looked out over the cliffs, his gaze following the horizon. The island was quiet, peaceful, but it no longer felt remote or isolating. It felt like part of something greater, part of him. The gentle winds tugged at his clothes, but there was no presence, no whisper this time. The entity had fulfilled its purpose, and Archie, in turn, had come into his own. He smiled softly to himself, feeling the rhythm of the sea and the steady pulse of the island beneath his feet. There were no grand revelations left, but that was fine. He had found what he came here to discover: peace, purpose, and the freedom to simply be. And as he turned to face the new day, Archie felt ready to live fully with the quiet strength he had found within.